Ocean View Avenue was an industrial yet scenic waterfront street in Pacific Grove, California. Despite the economy being largely built around the many sardine canning factories that called the street home, an eclectic community of friends and neighbors just outside the factory walls would be what moved John Steinbeck to write a novel based on his time spent on this street. And just 13 years after that novel was published, Ocean View Avenue would be renamed in the book's honor, Cannery Row. Cannery Row is a truly potent slice-of-life novel. The short episodic format of its chapters are narratively sporadic and sometimes wholly unrelated to the overarching storyline of the book. Surprisingly, these brief vignettes are incredibly effective at binding a singular, cohesive experience, establishing the same distinct feeling from many different perspectives and settings. Steinbeck opens the novel by saying, "Cannery Row in Monterey, in California, is a poem. A stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habit, a nostalgia, a dream." And that pretty much summarizes the narrative style of the book. Every moment, no matter how important or relevant it is to the rest of the story, is expressed through pulpy and thorough prose. Whether beautiful, disgusting, or horrifying, this is what gives Cannery Row such a seamless, fleshed-out feeling despite so many chapters being self-contained and seemingly unrelated to the overall plot. I say seemingly unrelated because Steinbeck paints Cannery Row as mirroring the tide pools it borders. Each story beat is relatively self-contained, with its own moments and emotions, sometimes even its own characters, but like the tide pools, they're all connected. All the different people with their own cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic status, and beliefs all affect one another. The bird's eye view the author provides illustrates the town as one big living organism. Everyone's joy, tragedy, and horror in flux are in fact all syncopations of the same rhythm. The entire ecosystem of the town breathes with the reverberations of each episodic moment. I'm going to be talking about Cannery Row's sequel, which kinda sucks. Like, for being written after Cannery Row, Sweet Thursday is somehow significantly more dated. The female and non-white characters from the first book have been flattened into two-dimensional caricatures that have aged like milk. I think this is partially emblematic of Sweet Thursday's relationship with its characters being a lot more utilitarian than that of Cannery Row. Characters don't really get a chance to just passively be themselves like they did in the last book. Their actions are much more driven for the sake of either plot progression, comedy, or spouting off beliefs that, as I said, time hasn't been kind to. While I can breeze through rereading Cannery Row, Sweet Thursday honestly feels like a chore to get through. But with all that being said, something about Sweet Thursday caught my eye way more than anything in Cannery Row. Sweet Thursday is much more narratively linear than Cannery Row, primarily focusing on Doc. Doc was based off of Steinbeck's real-life friend Ed Ricketts, a marine biologist who had a laboratory between two of the street's canneries. Doc takes center stage in Sweet Thursday, wherein after coming back from serving in World War II, he feels a kind of emptiness. His pre-war life of collecting and selling specimens from the tide pools, occasionally having women over, and listening to opera ringing hollow. This manifests in Doc feeling three voices within him. The top voice being one of security and curiosity, the only one observing and appreciating the current moment. A middle voice, one of panic and uncertainty, asking a lot of uncomfortable questions about Doc's life and future. And the deepest voice, one of futility and existential dread, usually just saying lonesome over and over again. Rather panicked by this, he decides to throw himself into a new project. A paper about octopi and their similarities in humans in response to extreme stress. So it's pretty clear that Doc is depressed. It's never made exactly clear why. It could be his experience in World War II, it could be seeing the radical change the war brought to his hometown, it could just be because he's getting older. But one thing is clear. He cannot get himself to write this paper. Nothing's physically wrong with him, but he just feels immobilized. Polyvagal Theory, introduced by Stephen Porges in 1994, is, to be very, very simplistic, a framework for how we react to the outside world. The different states of being we find ourselves in as a result of our experiences. I want to make a quick disclaimer. Polyvagal theory is based on Porges' hypothesis of the role the vagal nerve plays in emotional regulation. The science surrounding this is controversial and somewhat new, and while I'm going to be using the neuroscientific terms Porges assigns to these states of being, I will not be speaking to the details of the theory nor their scientific legitimacy. I'm not going to delve into a debate I'm both highly unqualified for and disinterested by. I'm not an expert in neuroscience, evolutionary biology, or psychology. With that being said, even some of the theory's greatest detractors acknowledge that despite the flaws they may see in Porges' theory in terms of hard neuroscientific evidence, the framework of the theory, even just as metaphor, has been highly beneficial for many people suffering from depression or anxiety, in particular those who've experienced trauma. So, tell me if this sounds familiar. According to Porges, we fluctuate between three differing hierarchical states. Ventral, a state of safety and mindfulness; sympathetic, a state of cautious fight or flight; and dorsal, a state of immobilization. The freeze part of fight, flight, or freeze, almost akin to playing dead. You can think of these states as kind of like an upside-down traffic light, or three voices. The parallels between Doc's Three Voices in Sweet Thursday, a book written in 1954, and the three stages of response detailed in Polyvagal Theory, a psychological concept introduced 40 years later, are already startling enough on their own, but these parallels are just the beginning. Doc withdraws into his work, away from the community that he was considered a pillar of, retreating into this cycle of procrastination, guilt about the procrastination, which leads to more procrastination, and all the while he's just sinking deeper and deeper into that lonely bottom voice, what Porges calls dorsal. People know something's wrong with Doc, but no one knows how to help because he won't really accept any. I mentioned a while back that these states are hierarchical, meaning you cannot go from the top voice to the bottom voice or from the bottom to the top without first going through that middle voice. Or to put it in Porges' terms, you cannot go from dorsal to ventral without first going through sympathetic. That cautious fight-or-flight middle voice that asks uncomfortable questions. This is one of the many reasons why someone can't just snap out of depression. You can't go from being depressed to content without going through a state of relative discomfort, because withdrawing from the outside world and doing nothing is about as comfortable as a person can get. Keep in mind that when I say comfortable, I don't mean fun or pleasant, but simply lacking in perceivable immediate danger. When you're in that state of immobilization that comes with a depressive episode, doing even the bare minimum can feel impossible. The sense of safety that comes with just shutting down is so comfortable compared to doing literally anything else. Working on improving anything about your current state of being, or adjusting your life at all, is more than a challenge, it's a fight. And sometimes when you lose enough fights, or just think that a prospective fight feels impossible or too dangerous, your body can sometimes learn that its best chance of survival is playing dead. Procrastinating, disengaging from everything, and closing yourself off from everyone feels like the only option. But the way depression works is that after a while, you start to think that this bubble that you've created around yourself is all the world has to offer. The temporary safety that isolation can provide can hide the fact that prolonged isolation can not only be addictive, but significantly more damaging to your mental and physical health than the dangers of trying to make things better. Which is why what ends up happening in Sweet Thursday is so brilliant. It's towards the end of the story. Doc has procrastinated on his paper more or less the entire book, and the spring tides are coming up, which would be essential for the completion of his paper by providing fresh specimens for Doc's research. Doc is thoroughly discouraged at this point, having tied his entire sense of legacy and self-worth into this paper and having essentially given up on it, as well as pursuing his love interest, Susie. Doc's friends, and the whole town for that matter, are genuinely scared for what Doc is going through. This especially eats away at one of Doc's friends, Hazel, the well-meaning, violent oaf that is apparently compulsory in all of Steinbeck's literature, who, out of sheer concern and desperation to help Doc, sneaks into Doc's house while he's asleep, and breaks Doc's arm, sneaking out before Doc wakes up from the pain. And that bizarre act of violence singularly saves Doc's life. Because Doc wakes up, and now he has to ask for help. The community that he's kept himself from is finally able to operate once again as a singular ecosystem. Doc gets his arm cast by the local physician. He keeps his friends up to date on how he's doing. He's even able to go to the spring tides with the help of Susie. This one broken bone didn't cure his depression, but it forced Doc out of dorsal into sympathetic. It made Doc fight to break free of his seemingly disconnected tide pool and reconnect to the rest of his ecosystem. That's the big discovery Doc makes. For all this book's dated aspects, this is the diamond in the rough. The one timeless message in Sweet Thursday is that while you have to fight to make things better, you don't have to fight alone.